year is 1394 and James Stewart has just been born. Okay, cool, you're thinking, but who is James Stewart? James Stewart, or James I of Scotland, was the third Stuart king. The House of Stuart being quite a big one in Scottish history, as from 1371 to 1714 they ruled pretty much continuously over Scotland, and eventually over the entire kingdoms of Scotland, England and Ireland. It was during this time that the United Kingdom, the United States, the King James's Bible, the Scottish colony in Panama, and the world's first assassination by firearm occurred. More than just rulers though, they are generally seen as the house that brought Scotland from the Middle Ages, into the Renaissance, and even into the early modern era. So yeah, Scotland founded America, and technically we also founded Canada about 400 years earlier, if you count the Norse using Scots slaves as guinea pigs on the newfound continent. And all you thought that Scotland only brought Susan Boyle to the world stage, but I assure you, for a small bipolar nation of drunks, historically, we were shit hot. Okay, so I'm boasting about Scotland, but who are the Stuarts? So the first Stuart king was Robert II, son of Walter Stewart, the 6th High Stewart of Scotland, and Marjorie Bruce, daughter of Robert the Bruce. If the name is familiar, it's because he was poorly portrayed as a bad guy in Braveheart, when in reality he was a massive part of Scottish history, being instrumental in the First War of Scottish Independence, a fearless warrior, and an astute tactician. In the same day at Bannockburn, he planted his axe so firmly into the skull of Henry de Bohun that he snapped the shaft. He also effectively implemented a Schiltron formation against a superior English army with devastating success. The man is a legend, and one day he will get a video of his own, but alas he is not a Stuart. So I digress. The timeline of Scottish kings around this era goes Robert the Bruce, David the Bruce, Robert II, the first Stuart king, Robert III, and to where our story begins, James I. So why are we starting with a third Stuart king? Honestly, because Robert III was quite a boring character and not really worth writing about, and because Robert II kind of falls into the Robert the Bruce story. Yes, Robert II is the first Stuart king, but there's a lot of backstory there between David II, Robert's heir, and Robert II, Robert's, well, heir. It's confusing, but eventually we'll get round to it when we cover the Bruces. Alright, history nerd, but what are you going to teach me? Well, I'm going to tell you James's story, his beginning, his capture, and finally his murder. Did I not mention murder? Because it almost always ends in murder in Scottish history. Wait until we get to James IV, the last British monarch to be killed in battle. That was bloody and embarrassing. So it's 1394 and James is born along with his twin brother Robert. Robert, technically the older twin, however dies in infancy, making him no more than a footnote in history. Both sons of Robert III and Annabella Drummond, who apparently was still pushing out kids in their mid-40s, but anyway, I'm just going to skip ahead to 1401 when James was 7, because he was a kid and he didn't really do much. So we're in 1401 and Annabella Drummond dies of natural causes. Pretty rough by all accounts, but this is only getting worse as a year later in 1402, James's uncle, also called Robert Stewart, yep, that's 3 different Robert Stewarts just in this paragraph alone, this one being the Duke of Albany, along with the help of Archibald, the 4th Earl of Douglas, murdered James's surviving brother and heir to the Scottish throne, David, the Duke of Rothesay, at Falkland Palace. There is some backstory here between the Stuarts and the Douglases, and the Stuarts and themselves, but it's a story for another day, so anyway, here we are. James is 8 years old, and his mother and 2 brothers are dead. I'll repeat, history is unrelenting. Rough start, we can agree, but it only gets better, right? He's a king, no? Well, medieval Scotland, or the medieval period in general, being a king was a somewhat fickle situation, and this is only escalated by the fact that his own uncles kept plotting to murder him. So no, it doesn't get better, it almost never gets better. History can be so dark at times that even George R.R. Martin would blush, and we all remember that Jaime Cersei scene over Joffrey's body. Naturally, fears arose regarding James's safety after David was murdered, and plans to smuggle James to France began to come about at the end of 1405. We're in 1406, and James, whilst accompanying some nobles close to his father, got into a skirmish with the rival Douglas supporters. This forces the 12-year-old James to seek refuge on a small inlet off the coast, where he waits for a ship to arrive and take him to France. This happens in February of 1406, and it ends disastrously as English pirates capture the boat off the coast of England and turn James in to the English court. Robert III, upon hearing the news, apparently dies. That's it. Okay. Granted, he was 69 years old, meaning he was still pumping out kids in his 50s, but being 69 at the time, he was probably somewhat already on his way out anyway, and this news was just the final nail in the coffin. Or the first, I guess. Either way you look at it, Robert III has died. James, who was born 3rd in line to the throne, now aged 12, is crowned king. During what would become his 18-year absence, the Scottish court was pretty much ruled by the Albany Stuarts, under Robert Stewart, brother of the now deceased Robert III, and the Earls of Douglas. You might find it strange that Robert II had 2 children named Robert. Well, technically Robert III was born John and took the name Robert III whilst ascending to the throne, but don't let that fool you into thinking Robert II wasn't a madman. He had 5 children named John, 4 Alexanders, and 4 Walters, among countless others. But anyway, as you might imagine, the Albany Stuarts and the Douglases were in no rush to have a legitimate king back in Scotland, even going as far to refuse the ransom demanded by the English crown for James's return, which by all accounts is a dick move. It would take the death of Robert Stuart, that's the Duke of Albany, Robert Stuart, and the Douglases' power to weaken before they would begin to agree on a ransom for James. So, what did James do whilst he was in England? Well, he was sort of Theon Greyjoy and did develop what some might consider to be a bit of Stockholm Syndrome towards the English, admiring how Henry IV conducted his politics and generally handled his realm. Theon not wreaked. That is probably worth distinguishing. That said, it was all kind of in vain, as Henry IV would die in 1413 and Henry V took over and placed James in the Tower of London, along with all the other Scottish prisoners. It took some time for James's position to be upgraded from prisoner to guest, but eventually he did get an upgrade, which is shown by the fact in 1420 he accompanied Henry V to France to use his presence against the Scots, fighting in France for the French. This is quite a big deal, as this is 130 years into the Old Alliance, an alliance between Scotland and France that lasted for around a quarter of a millennium. That said, if you don't want to turn from Theon into Reek, it's probably best to do as you're told, especially if you've already spent a couple years in the Tower of London previously. Henry V died aged 36 in 1422 in the Regency Council of Henry VI, saw little use for James and looked to ransom him out as soon as possible. The Douglases were pretty much the big power in Scotland at this point, and whilst generally it's not good for an earl's rule to have a new power come into play, especially if you're top dog and all, this kind of worked out for the Douglases, at least for now, as the Douglas clan's grip of their earldom was currently in jeopardy. The Douglases agreed to aid in bringing back James from England, as long as the James endorsed the Douglases' position within the kingdom. James agreed, a ransom was negotiated, and that was it. In 1424, King James I was back in Scotland, and for the first time, sitting upon the Scottish throne. Okay, it's a nice story, right? But I told you there was going to be murder, so where's the murder? Alright, so we're now in 1425, and King James has found a bunch of prominent members of the Albany Stuarts guilty of treason, and put them all to death. Eventually, an assassination plot started to grow, which eventually included another uncle, Walter Stuart, Earl of Athol, and another pissed-off son of Robert II, the Athol Stuarts, who had initially helped in returning the king to Scotland, and ironically, Walter Stuart himself, who had originally been part of the jury that found his nephew, Murdoch Stuart, the second Duke of Albany, guilty of treason, which led to him being beheaded. They would, however, slowly join in the conspiracy to commit regicide. It took until 1437 for the assassination to occur, which in itself is impressive. How do you manage to keep a regicidal conspiracy a secret for 12 years? They definitely put some time into planning it, if nothing else. Athol's grandson and heir, Robert Stuart, the King's Chamberlain, led about 30 conspirators into Blackfriars Church, including Robert Graham, who led the conspirators along with Christopher and Robert Chambers, who had previously attempted to try and arrest the King at the Perth Council. James was alerted to the men's presence and took refuge in a sewer system, although sadly, like medieval Shawshank Redemption with an M. Night Shyamalan twist, the sewer had recently been blocked off to prevent tennis balls from escaping, so standing in a tunnel of human excrement, the king was stabbed to death, with Robert Graham personally delivering the final fatal blow. Joan Beaufort, Queen Consort of Scots and wife of King James I, was injured during the attack but managed to survive, along with James II, who was not present at the church. Beaufort attempted to be Queen Regent of Scotland after the assassination, at least until her son was of age, but being an English woman didn't sit well with the Scots, and the Douglases regained the majority of the power in Scotland through Archibald, the 5th Earl of Douglas. Archibald, who was previously imprisoned by James I in 1431, so it's safe to say they were not looking to install James II as king. Alright, you piss poor armchair historian, and how are you going to end your pointless history lesson? Well, with murder. Lots and lots of glorious murder. So in the aftermath of the regicide, Robert Stuart, Sir Robert Graham, and Walter Stuart were all put to death. Robert Stuart apparently confessed to his role in the murder, having been the one to unbar the doors and allow the assassins into the royal apartments, and was beheaded for it. Sir Robert Graham was caught in Perth a few months later, tried and beheaded, but Walter Stuart got the full Braveheart treatment. facing the worst of the executions, and being spread out over 3 days to really make the most of the occasions. The festivities started with Walter being hoisted and dropped to ruin the joints, before being tied to a pillory, and being crowned a crown of burning irons bearing the inscription, King of all traitors. And then came day 2, where he was bound and dragged through the streets of Edinburgh, and maybe even had his eyes burned out with hot iron. And to conclude your inner bloodlust, finally on day 3, we go full Braveheart. He was disemboweled, his entrails burned before his face, his heart was torn out by hand, and again burned before his eyes, or what was left of them, before finally being beheaded and quartered, with parts of his former body being sent around Scotland for public display. Death fucking metal. And with that in mind, I hope you enjoyed this little tale, providing your uncles don't plan a plot to assassinate you in the meantime, and if they do, at least pull it off within a 12-year period. I'll hopefully see you again for James II.